Hey, thanks for joining me today. In today's video, I'm going to teach you how to cast the fins and the gills and then attach those to your fish replica. So let's get right to that video. It's now time to cast the fins and the gills from the mold we made way back in session 1. So I'm going to take my fiberglass resin, 1/2 ounce, take some chop, thicken that up. That'll give me good support on the fins. It'll give me good thickness. I'm going to mix that up really well. And then I'm going to add my MEKP. You want to make sure you mix that completely, get it off the sides. And we're going to take that resin with the catalyst and the chop, and we're going to put it on our mold. You only have to put it on one side. Spread that evenly. Make sure you got all the chop spread evenly so that you get good thickness. Now we don't want to squeeze this too hard because the fins will be too thin and then they're easily broken, and we don't want to do that. So we'll put a couple clamps on it. You'll see the resin ooze out immediately. Messy part. And we're going to let that set. I waited about an hour. And after an hour, I come out to check the fins. What we're going to do now is separate the mold. So I'm going to look for a seam, and I'm going to take a small screwdriver and I'm going to hammer into the seam, but we're not making a mold now, we're making a cast. So you want to be careful that you don't go in too far and damage the fiberglass resin or break a fin. So I'm going to work all the way around the edge where you see the seam until I can get the mold apart easily. Once again, just like a fish mold, you don't want to rush. It's not overly difficult to separate fins, but you want to take your time. Here's a little tip. Sometimes I'll go to a bigger size screwdriver. As you rotate that clockwise, when you have it between the two halves, it helps separate it a little easier. Gives you a little more leverage. This one I had some fiberglass spill over the side, and that's what was creating the issue of separating that. But once you separate the mold, take your little putty knife and slide it underneath the fiberglass resin carefully. Work all the way around the outside, work towards the middle until everything releases and your fin cast comes out. I also have the 2 gills I'm going to use. Remember, we flared the operculum, so we have to show some of the gills. Once you have released the resin and got the cast out, what I'm doing here is I'm just rough cutting out around each of the fins, the 2 pectoral fins, the 2 pelvic fins, and the gills. And that's what it looks like when you rough cut them. And now I'm going to take it to where I do my Dremel work, and I'm going to cut in along the sides until I shape these fins into something that looks decent and presentable to put back on the fish. Take your time. You can see the outline of the fins that you cast, and that's where you go. That's your marker. You can go a little beyond that if it looks a little rough, but you want to shape the fins the way they look, and that's all you're doing. You're just shaping them. And you do this to each fin, both pectoral fins, both pelvic fins, and cut in on your gills. It's important that your fins look believable. It's amazing that you can reproduce them this way, but once you have all your fins done, both of your pectoral fins, both of your pelvic fins and the gills themselves, you need to clean them. So I take some Dawn and an old toothbrush, and I wet the fins down. And the reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm doing the cleaning is twofold. I want to get all of the residue off of the fins from the powderized fiberglass from grinding and shaping, but there's also PVA on here to keep the mold and the cast from sticking, and you want to remove all that. The PVA is water-based, so it will remove, and what it gives you is a nice transparent fin that you don't need to do a lot of painting on. It depends on the species, but they're very believable because of the natural color of the fiberglass. Now, fiberglass, the longer it sits on the shelf, it tends to darken a little. So all of these chemicals have a shelf life. So I'm going through cleaning all the fins. You want to clean all the fins, and when you're done, this is what they look like. Here's all your fins on the left and the right side of the fish. I'm going to start with the left pelvic fin, simply because if you do the pectoral fin first, it tends to get in the way. So I start with the pelvic fin, and my vise has a nice base on it. It's got a rotating clamp, so you can position it in any position, and I like to work here. What I'm doing, I'm taking that left pelvic fin and I'm making sure that it fits properly, and then this is what I use. These are my clamps. They're called helping hands, but I just call it a fin clamp. You take a little piece of paper, put it on the end of the fin so that the gator jaw doesn't damage the fin, because they're pretty thin. And I'm gonna put it in place, make sure I get the angle just right, and then I'm gonna mix up my epoxy. I use a 5-minute epoxy. Once I'm happy with the position, I will then move the clamp away a little bit and get ready to attach. And I use a 50-50 epoxy mix. I use a 5-minute set time. So you put out equal amounts, and you don't need to use a lot for fins, like a water drop size. Equal amounts of hardener and epoxy, and then you mix that up. And once it mixes, you've got about 5 minutes, maybe a little longer, but it starts to set up enough to hold the fin. And what I will do is I will apply the epoxy to the fish body, and I will also apply the epoxy to the fin, and then I'll take my clamp and I will position it so that it fits tightly against the fish. And then I'm going to replace the flesh that we removed when we cut the fins off. Once I'm happy with that, I'll let it sit. Then I go to the left pectoral fin. This is like the fish's left arm. I do everything in reference to the fish, like you were looking out. So I'm going to remove my clamp from the pelvic fin, and now I'm going to put the pectoral fin, kind of like the fish's left arm. I'm just checking it for fit, mix up my epoxy. I'll put a little bonding epoxy down to where the fin is going to go. I've got my clamp already positioned, and then I'll slide that into place. And then I'm going to put back the part of the fish we removed when we cut the fin out. We want to replace that. We want to add that back, and the epoxy does a good job of that. We'll have to do some touch-up work when we're done. Once that sets, and I give the fins really, even though they set in 5 minutes, I give them 15 minutes to half an hour. I don't like to disturb them. Now we're going to do the left gill. I'm going to put that in the clamp, but I have to paint this gill before I attach it. Because if you don't, you'd have to mask off your fish to keep the overspray from getting on the fish. It's just easier to paint the gill before you put it on. And I'm going to use a bright red transparent paint. I don't want to use opaque. I want the detail of the gill to show through. And I'm using the white piece of paper so that I don't get overspray on my workbench, but it also shows me the direction of my paint pattern so that I just capture the edges of the gill. And I flip it around and do the other side. This is very, very believable once it's done. Now, I don't have to do all the gill plates because we didn't flare the gills that much. The operculum is only open a little bit, so you're only going to be able to see about one gill. Now, if you were flaring like a bass, you'd have to show all 4 or 5 gill plates, depending on how many the species has. I apply my epoxy, and then I'm going to take a pair of forceps and I'm going to set that gill plate in. And once I do that, I want to make sure I get it positioned exactly where I want it. Remember, you have about 5 minutes of working time, maybe a little longer, but once it starts to set, you can't do a whole lot with it. So you want to be exact the first time. And once once I'm happy with the position, I'll add a little more epoxy just to hold it into place. And that's how you do the gill plate. And now you can see why you want to paint it before you put it in. Now, that's the left side of the fish. There you can see everything done. We have the pelvic fin on the bottom. We have the pectoral fin is next. That's like its left arm. And then the gill plate is in place underneath the operculum. Now you need to do the complete right side of the fish next. The procedure is exactly the same, and just flip everything around and put them in, and that's what it looks like once it's done. And that's how you attach the fins and put the gills in place. In our next video, session 7, I'm going to teach you how to paint the eyes and then set those in your replica. You don't want to miss that. That's pretty cool. Hey, I'm Mr. R, and don't forget to like the video. This is the Rondinelli Project, and we gone.